Hello, welcome to Glastonbury Romance Part 9. Yesterday I said that was number 7, but it was number 8. This is number 9. You'll figure it out. So, when last we met, all the family was gathered together. The will had been read by Mr. Dillington, and people weren't very happy with where all the money went and all the estates. So Philip, who I think owns some kind of mine, is there, as well as John Crow, our plucky, foxy protagonist, his cousin Mary, um, his aunt. Oh, I forget her name right now. I think it's Elizabeth. And there's these two revolutionary characters that I think are his cousins as well. So Philip is about to interrupt them. And now let's continue. Philip's own voice broke into the talk at this moment. It did not fail to strike him that Aunt Elizabeth and the four young cousins, in their obvious indifference to the grotesque event of £40,000 passing from the Crow family to the Geared family, had succeeded in ostracizing him in a sort of moral solitude. He and his wife might go on quarreling with Mr. Didlington over this fiasco. The others were civilized people prepared to take a more financial blow with becoming urbanity. "Don't lump me and Dave Spear together," he interrupted, pushing his way between Aunt Elizabeth and Mary with jocular bluster. "Percy would never cook him another meal if she thought he had anything in common, if we had anything in common. To my pretty purse, I shall never be anything but a bloated capitalist, shall I?" And he also, just as Aunt Elizabeth had done, put his arm around the tall girl's slender waist. "Cousin Tilly," cried Dave Spear, with a schoolboy grin on his broad countenance, "come and stop Philip from flirting with my wife." But Mrs. Crow, who had just rung the bell and had had a long, whispered conversation with the maid who answered it, was herself at that moment upbraiding Mr. Didlington in a plaintive but penetrating voice. "She says that horrible man departed yesterday for Glastonbury. I suppose both of you knew that grandfather had left him everything." She paused and then turned to her husband. "Tea's ready in the dining room, Philip," she said. The lawyer made his way to the group in the center of the room and allowed his answer to Tilly's shrewish attack to be a general professional reply to them all. "It is true," he said, "that Mr. Geared was aware, just as I was aware, of the late canon's intentions. And as his family live in Glastonbury, it was natural, and indeed suitable, that he should proceed there at once to acquaint them with his very considerable bequest." "Well, Didlington," returned Philip, looking round at the company, "I hope you will do my wife the pleasure of letting her pour out tea for you? Pour out tea for you? Shall we go into the dining room? Will you follow Mrs. Crow, Didlington?" He opened the door, and they all trooped out into the passage. Down this way they moved, past the broad staircase, where the walls were hung with some really valuable oil paintings selected by William Crow's great-uncle. Not far from the staircase was the front door leading, through a pleasant conservatory, out into the courtyard. It was through this door rather than any other that Mr. Didlington now hastened to pass, picking up his hat from a marble table that offered itself conveniently to his attention. "Have to get home, Crow. The wife expects me, you know, and it's quite a walk. If I stayed to tea with all you good folk, I shouldn't be at Methwald till after dark." Meathwald, it's probably pronounced. Philip had the wit to see that Tilly's tactless outbursts had really upset the worthy man. What wild creatures women are! He followed the lawyer out into the conservatory, which was fragrant with heliotrope and Lebanon verbena. "You must forgive Mrs. Crow, Didlington," he said quietly, and then, as the man only nodded with a faint shrug of his shoulders, "The great point you have made clear," he went on, "is that the family has no case against this fellow. We should have no chance, eh? Not the ghost of a chance of upsetting this will?" Mr. Didlington gravely bowed and buttoned his overcoat with his free hand pensively picking a leaf from the lemon verbena with the one that held his stick. "Not the ghost of a chance, eh?" repeated Philip. The man straightened and looked him in the face. "I am acting," he said, "for all parties concerned." He paused and resumed with great real dignity. "My position as executor is a difficult one. Mr. Geard recognizes its difficulties. His departure for Glastonbury proves that he does so. I hope that there may arise no occasion for the introduction of further advice, and Mr. Geard hopes so too." "I warrant he does," thought Philip, but he only said, "I confess to be startled, Didlington. You must have expected us to be startled." The lawyer continued crumpling up between his fingers the lemon verbena leaf. "Mr. Geard has been your grandfather's valet," he said, "his secretary, his confidant, and, I might say, if you'll permit the word, his friend, for the last 10 years. No opinion you called it would advise you to content the will." Philip Crowe bent down and smelt a heliotrope. "Won't you change your mind, Didlington, after all, and let my good wife give you a cup of tea? She was overexcited just now. It was a surprise, you know, and ladies always take things hard. I expect if Mr. Geard hadn't been well known to us in Glastonbury as a rather trying local preacher, she wouldn't have felt—" The lawyer shook his head. "In case there arose," he said, "in the mind of any of your family a wish for further advice, I would like to point out that the late canon's doctor, a good friend of mine, feels as I do that your grandfather's mind was never clearer than during the time he made this will. No reputable firm would take up this case, sir, on the grounds of undue influence. Everybody knows, if you allow me to be quite frank, that his family left the late canon very much alone, and it is natural enough that under these circumstances—" Well, I'm afraid I must be getting back to my guest," interrupted Philip coldly. "I wish you a pleasant walk here home, Mr. Didlington." He opened the door of the conservatory and bowed the man out. No sooner had he entered the dining room than Tilly Crowe, peering at him around the great copper urn which stood on the table in front of her, with a little blue flame burning below it, cried out to him in a tearful, plaintive voice, "It was her own doing, Philip. That's what hurts me most. Oh, why did we ever let that man go to him?" "What kind of man is he, this lucky wretch?" Percy Spear inquired, as the head of the family sat down at the end of the table. "He was an open-air preacher who lived in Glastonbury, Perce," Philip explained. "He was always out of luck and had a wife and 2 children. He was a nuisance to the whole town, and when your grandfather wanted a lay reader, or someone who combined the duties of a valet and a curate, we packed him off to him. No one would have dreamed of this being No one would have dreamed of this being the result." "Perhaps he isn't a bad sort of chap after all," remarked Dave Spear. "Did you ever see him, Mary?" Mary shook her head. "I suppose," said John in a low voice, as if speaking rather to himself than to anyone in particular, "there is no way he could be persuaded to give up some of it?" Philip gave him a swift glance of infinite disgust. "One doesn't do that sort of thing in England, Mr. Crowe," he said. "Not, at any rate, people in our position." "A will is a funny thing," said Dave Spear meditatively. "A dead man arbitrarily gives to some little living person the power that he has robbed the community of. The mere existence of a thing like a will is enough to prove the unnaturalness of private property." Aunt Elizabeth looked anxiously at Philip. "Don't start a discussion of politics now, I beg you, Dave Spear," she said. "My quarrel with Spear," interjected Philip in a low tone, "is not confined to politics." "What is it confined to?" cried Persephone sharply. "Don't you begin teasing me, Dave," she went on, and as she spoke, she stretched out a long, delicious young girl's arm across the table, and taking Philip's hand in her own, gave it a little playful, scolding shake. Philip caught her fingers and held them gravely, while he looked intently into her eyes. John saw the communist's rather rustic countenance wince sharply while the magnetic vibration passed between the cousins. "What puzzles me about your theories, Mr. Spear," began John, speaking rather rapidly, "is that they can contradict the deepest instincts in human nature. To possess! Doesn't the whole world, for every one of us, turn upon this great pivot? Our philosophy, for instance. What is it but the act by which we possess the cosmos? Our love. That surely is the quintessence of possession. And isn't this asceticism which you people practice, this giving up of everything except the bare essentials, as you call them, isn't it a sort of wet blanket thrown upon human nature, a sort of moral rebuke to the natural pleasures? I think you will agree, Mr. Crow, began Spear excitedly, but his wife broke in. Let me put it to him, Dave, she cried. The point is this, Mr. Crow. We fully agree with you about the importance of a free fling of our whole nature towards happiness. But it isn't just this that the capitalist system interferes with. You were confusing two things. You were confusing natural, instinctive happiness and the artificial social pride that we get from private property. Under a just and scientific arrangement of society, such as they have achieved in Russia, our human values begin to change. People feel ashamed of having money. It becomes a disgrace, like the reputation of a thief, to have more than the essentials. But everyone has a right to the pleasures that bring happiness. Everyone has a right to... She means, interrupted her husband, raising his voice to a very vigorous pitch, she means, Mr. Crow, that everyone who works honestly and doesn't live by exploiting others can have enough to enjoy their life on. The exploiting classes, of course, here he nearly shouted, causing Tilly to give a quick glance at the door, afraid lest a servant should hear him, must be starved out. The contrast was so great between the rosy face of their fair-haired youth and the fanaticism of his tone that John stared at him in astonishment. Into the darkening twilight, past all those dim faces sitting around at the table, the fierce words, must be starved out, twanged like a bowstring. Philip's crow from the end of the table cast upon the young revolutionary very much the sort of glance that some devois of the Norman conquest would have cast upon some Saxon Gurk who had dared to challenge him and his horse broke through the brushwood and raised quarterstaff. You could starve me out, my son, if you won over the army and the air force, but I assure you, you will have one bloated capitalist you'll never starve out. Philip means our friend Mr. Geard, I suppose, murmured Aunt Elizabeth. I mean nature. Persephone gave vent to a rather uncivil whistle. Nature? She mocked. What are you talking about, Philip? Don't you see, my good child, he said quite gently, that it's always been by the brains and the energy of exceptional individuals, fighting for their own hands, that the world has moved on? What you people are doing now is simply sharing out what has already been won. We have the future to think of, or as I say, nature has the future to think of. The blood rushed to the face of Dave's Spear, and a misty film gathered in front of his eyes, so that when he saw of the room and the people in the room was a swimming blur. I can't argue with you, he jerked out, and each word carried with it a streak of his heart's blood. But I know that if the masses of workers, the real workers, got the machinery and the land and water into their hands, a new spirit not known before in all of the history of humanity, conscious of the fate, would be stronger, greater, more godlike than anything that your great selfish individuals have felt. So again, we have one of these weird sections. Doing my best here. In his motion, the young man had lurched to his feet and had seized with his fingers a half-cut loaf of bread which he began squeezing spasmodically. Aunt Elizabeth stretched forth her hand and removed the object. But not before this particular gesture in this darkening room, with the damp green lawn and the somber cedar outside, had caught John's attention as something symbolic. Long afterward, John remembered this clumsy, bucolic figure leaning forward over the shadowy, unlit table and clutching that bread, with far more force than the slender Percy's eloquence, those awkward, blurted words, seemed to carry the seal of prophecy upon them. A green-colored gust of rainy wind came rushing across that spacious garden, came swishing and swirling through the laurel bushes, came moaning through the cedar boughs. Well, that's good enough for today, I think. We got some revolutionary talk. We got some capitalist, some philosophical arguments going on. Leave your comments in the below. I probably mispronounced. It got a good amount of flowers, so if you want to tell me how to correctly pronounce them, let me know. And I'll see you tomorrow. Cheers.